The debt was not hers. Susanna Cole had never signed a promissory note in her life, and she said so, clearly and firmly, to the man standing in her doorway on a Tuesday morning in October, with a piece of paper in his hand and the look of someone who enjoyed delivering bad news. His name was Garvin Hatch, and he ran the mercantile in Copper Flat, and he had been running it for 12 years, in a way that made him the richest man in town and the most feared, because Garvin Hatch extended credit the way a spider extends silk, generously, patiently, and with the full intention of catching something in it. "Your husband signed this note 6 months before he died," Hatch said. "$42 for seed and tools and provisions. It is past due. I am calling it in. My husband has been dead for 8 months. He never mentioned a debt to you." Dying men do not always mention their debts. Susanna looked at the paper. It bore a signature that looked like her husband Robert's, the same loops, the same forward slant, but something about it was wrong. She had seen Robert sign 100 documents, and the signature on this paper was too clean, too careful, the handwriting of someone copying rather than writing. But she could not prove that standing in her doorway with Garvin Hatch's shadow across her threshold. "What happens if I cannot pay?" she asked. "I take the farm. The note is secured against the property." She closed the door. She sat at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the wood and breathed. $42. She had 11 in the jar on the shelf, and the rest was in the corn that had not been harvested yet, and the cow that she could not sell, because without the cow, she would have no milk and no butter and no way to feed herself through the winter. Robert had been a good man, a quiet, careful man, who kept his accounts in a leather-bound book and never bought what he could not pay for. He had died of a fever in February, quickly and without warning, and he had left Susanna the farm and the cow and $11 and no debts, because Robert Cole did not believe in debts. The idea that he had signed a promissory note with Garvin Hatch for $42 was absurd. But absurdity does not matter when a man has a piece of paper with your husband's name on it, and the law on his side. Susanna spent the next 2 days trying to find help. She was not a woman who asked for help easily. 3 years on the farm with Robert and 8 months alone had taught her to shoe a horse, dress a wound, shoot a coyote, and balance a ledger, and she had done all of these things without complaint or assistance. But a forged debt was not a coyote. It could not be shot. It had to be argued, and arguing required someone who understood the law, and Susanna understood corn and cattle, and the way a fence post needs to be set 3 feet deep in Wyoming clay. She did not understand the law. The weight of the situation settled on her over those 2 days, like dust settling after a windstorm. She could not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table where Robert had sat every evening with his account book, and she ran the numbers, and the numbers always came out the same way. She could not pay $42 without selling the farm, and selling the farm was what Hatch wanted, because the land was worth 10 times the note, and Hatch knew it. He had done this deliberately. He had waited until Robert was dead and Susanna was alone, and then he had produced a piece of paper, and the patience of a man who knows that a lone woman in a frontier town has no one to call. She went to the sheriff. The sheriff was out of town. She went to the circuit judge's clerk. The clerk said the judge was not due for 6 weeks. She went to the minister, who was sympathetic and useless. She went to the 3 women she knew in Copper Flat, and they were sympathetic and afraid, because each of them owed money to Garvin Hatch, and crossing him meant calling in their own notes. On the 3rd day, Susanna was standing outside the mercantile, trying to decide whether to go inside and argue or go home and cry, when a man she had never seen before walked out of the livery across the street, stopped, looked at her face, and said, "You look like a woman with a problem." His name was Jesse Calloway. He was the new federal marshal assigned to the territory, passing through Copper Flat on his way to Fort Garland. He was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and a star pinned to his vest, and the kind of face that had been through enough trouble to recognize it on someone else. He had a law book in his saddlebag because he believed that the law should be carried the same way a man carries a weapon, close to hand, well-maintained, and used precisely. Susanna told him, She stood on the boardwalk outside the Mercantile and told him about Robert's death and Hatch's note, and the $42, and the signature she did not believe was real. And Jesse Calloway listened the way a man listens when he is trained to hear what is not being said, as well as what is. "Do you have any of your husband's writing? Letters, receipts, anything with his signature?" "His account book. He kept it in the bureau." "Get it. Bring it to me at the boarding house this evening. And do not tell Hatch I am asking." She brought the account book. Jesse sat at the boarding house table and opened it, and found Robert Cole's handwriting, the receipts, the lists, the careful notations of every transaction, and he laid the promissory note beside it, and compared them line by line, letter by letter, the way a man reads a trail when the sign is faint and the stakes are high. "The signature is forged," he said. Susanna's breath left her body. She had known it. She had felt it in her bones the moment she saw the paper. But hearing a federal marshal say it was different from feeling it herself. "How can you tell?" "Your husband's natural hand has a rightward break on the downstroke of the R. This signature has no break. It is a copy, not a signing. Someone traced it." He closed the account book and looked at her. "Mrs. Cole, has Garvin Hatch done this to anyone else?" She thought about it. She thought about Della Wright, whose husband had died the previous winter, and who had suddenly owed Hatch $60. She thought about Clara Sims, who had lost her boarding house to Hatch's foreclosure 3 months ago. She thought about old Mrs. Purdy, who now lived in a room above the saloon because Hatch had taken her house. "Yes," she said slowly, "I think he has done it to several women, all widows, all alone." Jesse's jaw tightened. The blue eyes that had been calm and professional went cold in a way that told Susanna this was no longer a favor for a stranger on a boardwalk. This was the thing he had been trained for, the thing that made him ride 12 hours to serve a paper and sleep on the ground and eat jerky for supper and keep going. This was wrong, and he was going to make it right. "Tell me their names," he said. "I do not know, but he owns paper on half the town." Jesse Calloway stayed in Copper Flat. He did not announce his investigation. He did not visit the Mercantile. He spent 3 days in the boarding house, and the land office, and the county records, pulling notes and comparing signatures. And what he found made him close his law book and put his hat on and walk to the Mercantile on a Saturday morning when Garvin Hatch was behind the counter and the store was full of customers. "Garvin Hatch," Jesse said. He set 4 promissory notes on the counter, Susanna's and 3 others he had found in the county files, all bearing signatures that showed the same careful, breakless forgery. "These notes are fraudulent. The signatures were traced, not signed. I am a federal marshal, and I am placing you under arrest for forgery, fraud, and the unlawful seizure of property." The store went silent. Hatch's face went from red to white in the space of a breath. "You cannot prove that." Jesse opened the law book to a page he had marked with a strip of leather. Section 41 of the Territorial Code provides that a forged instrument is void on its face, and that the forger is subject to imprisonment and forfeiture. "I do not need to prove it here, Mr. Hatch. I need to prove it in front of the judge, and I will." Susanna was standing at the back of the store. She had come in to buy salt and had not known Jesse would be there, and she watched him work. Calm, precise, thorough, the law in his hand, and the truth on his side. And she felt something break loose inside her chest that had been locked there since the day Hatch had stood in her doorway with his forged paper and his patient smile. It was not just relief. It was the feeling of being defended, of having someone stand between her and the thing that was trying to crush her and say, "Show me the paper." Hatch was taken to the county jail. The circuit judge arrived 2 weeks later and found him guilty of forgery on 4 counts, and ordered restitution and 6 months of imprisonment, and banned him from conducting business in the territory. The 4 women whose notes had been forged, Susanna and 3 others, all widows, all alone, all chosen because they had no one to speak for them, had their debts voided and their property cleared. Jesse Calloway stayed for the trial. He stayed for the verdict. He stayed for the week after the verdict, because he wanted to make sure Hatch's associates did not retaliate against the women who had testified. And then he stayed for another week, because he had no particular reason to leave, and one very particular reason to stay. He rode out to Susanna's farm on a Sunday afternoon. During those weeks of the trial and its aftermath, Jessie had come to the farm twice, once to take her deposition and once to return Robert's account book, and each time he had stayed longer than the errand required. The first time he had fixed the gate latch that had been sticking since August, without being asked, and she had given him coffee and a slice of cornbread, and they had sat on the porch, and he had told her about the law, not the dry language of the statutes, but the living, breathing practice of it, the way it was supposed to protect people like her from people like Hatch, and the way it so often failed, because the people who needed it most were the people who could least afford to ask for it. The second time he had arrived in the rain, and she had made him come inside and dry his coat by the stove, and they had talked for 3 hours. About everything, about nothing, about the way the light fell on the Sangre de Cristos at sunset, and the way a well-made fence looks against snow, and the particular loneliness of a person who is competent enough to survive alone, but tired enough to want company. She had told him about Robert, about his kindness, his quietness, his steady hands, and his steady heart, and the way he had died so quickly that she had not had time to say the things she should have said. Jessie had listened without trying to fill the spaces Robert had left, and she had been grateful for that, because the spaces were not his to fill. They were Robert's. What Jessie offered was new space, his own, different, built from different materials but just as solid. The corn was harvested, and the cow was in the barn, and the farm was quiet and clean, and Susanna was on the porch in a shawl, reading, and she looked up when she heard his horse, and her face did the thing he had been hoping it would do. It opened, not with surprise, with recognition, the look of a woman seeing someone she had been expecting, without knowing she was expecting him. "Marshal," she said. "Jessie? Jessie, would you like coffee?" He tied his horse and came up the steps and stood on the porch and said, "Mrs. Cole, I have been a marshal for 9 years. I have ridden more miles than I can count, and I have served more papers and arrested more men than I care to remember, and in all that time I have not once wanted to stop riding. But I rode out here today, and I saw your farm, and I saw you on this porch, and I thought, that is where I want to be." Susanna set her book down. "You want to be on my porch? I want to be wherever you are." She looked at him, this lean, careful, principled man who had ridden into Copper Flat on his way somewhere else, and had stopped because he saw a woman with a problem, and had stayed because the problem led to a crime, and the crime led to justice, and the justice led to something neither of them had planned for. "Then sit down," she said. "The coffee is hot." He sat down. He came back the next Sunday, and the one after that. They talked about the territory, and the law, and the weather, and the price of corn, and the way a cat will sit in a patch of sunlight, as if it owns the sun. She told him about Robert's account book, and the careful way he had recorded every penny. And Jessie said, "He was a good man." And she said, "Yes, he was." And there was no jealousy in it, no competition, just two people acknowledging the truth of a life that had ended, and the possibility of one that was beginning. One evening in January she was reading by the lamp, and Jessie was sitting across from her, whittling a handle for a broken hoe. He had started fixing things around the farm the way water finds a channel, naturally, without announcement. And she looked up and found him watching her, with an expression she recognized, because she had seen it in her own reflection that morning. The expression of a person who has found something they were not looking for, and cannot imagine going back to the time before they found it. "Jessie," she said. "Yes. Stop whittling and ask me what you want to ask me." He set the knife down. "Susanna Cole, will you marry me?" "Yes, I have been waiting 3 Sundays for you to ask." He laughed, a quiet, surprised, grateful laugh. And she laughed too, and the sound of it filled the small farmhouse the way Robert's silence used to fill it. Differently, but just as completely. By December, he had moved his territorial office to Copper Flat. By February, he had built a bookshelf for her parlor, and she had mended the tear in his duster, and they had spent enough evenings on that porch to fill a lifetime of conversation. They were married in March by the circuit judge who had convicted Garvin Hatch, the same judge, in the same courtroom, which Susanna thought was fitting. She wore her Sunday dress, and Jesse wore his star. And when the judge asked if anyone objected, there was a silence so deep you could hear the flag snapping on the pole outside. Because nobody in Copper Flat objected. Nobody dared. The marshal had come to town and done the thing nobody else would do. He had opened a law book and read what was written there, and held a powerful man accountable. And the woman who had been the target of that man's fraud was now the marshal's wife. And if there was justice in the territory, it looked like that. A woman on a porch with a book, a man with a star and a law book, and a forged note torn in half and thrown in the fire where it belonged.